Daniel sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, staring at the email he was about to send. His hands were shaking slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. Outside the window, the city stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of concrete and glass towers reaching toward the sky. 15 years. That's how long he'd been climbing this ladder, chasing promotions, working late nights, missing birthdays and weekends. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. His phone buzzed for the 100th time that day. Another urgent message. Another crisis that needed solving immediately. Another weekend that would disappear into conference calls and deadline crunches. He looked around at the expensive furniture, the awards on the wall, the view that everyone said was worth millions. None of it meant anything anymore. 3 months ago, something inside him had broken. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was more like a slow crack spreading across glass. He'd been in back-to-back meetings for 12 hours straight when his vision started to blur. The doctor said it was stress and exhaustion. Prescribed some pills and told him to take it easy. But Daniel knew it was deeper than that. He'd forgotten who he was underneath all the job titles and responsibilities. That night, unable to sleep as usual, he'd done something unusual. Instead of scrolling through work emails, he'd started watching videos about people who'd left everything behind. Off-grid living, sustainable homesteads, people building their own homes in the wilderness with their bare hands. At first, it seemed like fantasy. Entertainment for burned-out professionals who'd never actually do it. But the seed was planted. He started researching obsessively. During boring conference calls, he had tabs open about solar panels and water collection systems. On his lunch breaks, he watched tutorials about building cabins. At night, instead of Netflix, he studied permaculture and wilderness survival. His girlfriend at the time thought it was just a phase, a midlife crisis. She'd laughed when he mentioned maybe buying some land somewhere remote. They broke up 2 weeks later. She wanted someone focused on the future they'd planned, not someone fantasizing about escaping to the woods. His parents were even less supportive when he first mentioned the idea. His father had worked 40 years in the same factory to put Daniel through college. The idea of throwing away a 6-figure salary to live like a hermit seemed like a slap in the face to everything they'd sacrificed. His mother cried. She was convinced he was having a breakdown and needed therapy, not a forest. But something had shifted in Daniel that couldn't be shifted back. Every morning, his alarm would go off at 5:30. He'd drag himself out of bed, put on the same expensive suit, drive through the same traffic, sit in the same office, solve the same types of problems. The money was good. The benefits were excellent. Everyone told him how lucky he was. Yet he felt like he was slowly disappearing, like a photograph left in the sun too long. The final straw came during the quarterly review meeting. His team had worked 100-hour weeks for 3 months straight to launch a new product. They'd succeeded. The launch was flawless, and in the meeting, the executives spent 2 hours discussing why the numbers weren't quite high enough. Not a single word of thanks. Not a mention of the human cost. Just charts and graphs and discussions about pushing harder next quarter. Daniel looked around the conference table at his colleagues. Everyone looked exhausted, gray-faced, running on coffee and determination. Several of them were definitely taking medication just to cope with the stress. One guy had gotten divorced last year because he was never home. Another had missed his daughter's entire childhood, always promising he'd be there next time. This was the future Daniel was looking at if he stayed. 20 more years of this. Maybe 30 if he couldn't afford to retire. That evening, he'd made the decision. He went home, opened his laptop, and started looking at land for sale. Not just browsing anymore. Actually looking with intent to buy. He found a 5-acre plot in the mountains, 3 hours from the nearest major city. Dense forest, a stream running through it, completely off-grid. The price was less than what he'd paid for his luxury car. He called the seller that night and made an offer. The next 2 months were a blur of preparation. He sold his condo, sold most of his possessions, bought a reliable truck and filled it with basic camping gear and tools. He told his boss he was quitting. The look on his supervisor's face was priceless. Confusion mixed with concern mixed with something that might have been envy. His boss tried to talk him out of it, offered him a raise, more vacation time, a different position. But Daniel had already mentally checked out. His co-workers threw him a goodbye party. It was awkward. Everyone kept asking what he was really going to do, like living in the forest was code for something else. Some people thought he'd landed a better job and was keeping it secret. Others whispered that he'd had a breakdown. A few made jokes about him becoming a crazy mountain man. They'd all laugh, raise their glasses, and promise to visit. None of them believed they actually would. His friends tried to stage an intervention. Sitting in his favorite coffee shop, 3 of his closest friends spent an hour trying to convince him he was making a huge mistake. They brought up every logical argument. What about healthcare? What about retirement savings? What if he got injured? What about dating? What about his career? He'd never be able to come back from this gap in his resume. They meant well, but every argument they made just confirmed he was doing the right thing. The night before he left, his mother called. She'd been crying. She told him she loved him but didn't understand why he was doing this. His father got on the phone and asked him one more time to reconsider. They'd always been proud of him. The first person in the family to graduate college, to have a real professional career. Now he was throwing it all away to play Tarzan in the woods. Daniel tried to explain that he wasn't running away from something. He was running toward something. But the words didn't come out right. How do you explain to someone that success was killing you? That last morning, he woke up at dawn in his nearly empty apartment. Everything he owned now fit in his truck. He'd kept his laptop, some clothes, camping equipment, basic tools, and a few books. The rest was gone, sold, or donated. He made one final cup of coffee in his old kitchen and looked around at the place that had been his home for 8 years. It felt like someone else's life now. The drive out of the city took 2 hours. Rush hour traffic one last time. He watched in his rearview mirror as the skyline got smaller and smaller. Part of him wondered if everyone was right, if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. The security of a steady paycheck, health insurance, a 401k, climate control. He was giving up everything that society said mattered. But another part of him felt lighter with every mile. His shoulders relaxed. His jaw unclenched. The knot in his stomach that had been there for years started to loosen. By the time he turned onto the dirt road that led to his property, he was actually smiling. A real smile, not the professional mask he'd worn for so long. The road got rougher. His truck bounced over ruts and rocks. Tree branches scraped the sides. Then the road ended. This was it. His 5 acres of forest. He stepped out of the truck and just stood there for a moment. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic, no sirens, no phone notifications. Just wind in the trees and birds calling to each other. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Everyone thought he was crazy. Maybe he was. But standing there in that forest, looking at the work ahead of him, Daniel felt alive for the first time in years. The hard part was about to begin. The first night in the forest was magical. Daniel set up his tent under a massive pine tree, built a small campfire, and cooked his dinner on a portable camping stove. The stars were incredible, more than he'd ever seen in his life. He fell asleep, listening to the sounds of the forest, feeling proud of himself for taking this leap. By the 3rd night, the magic had worn off completely. Rain started around midnight and didn't stop for 3 days. His tent leaked. Everything got wet, including his sleeping bag. The temperature dropped and he couldn't get a fire started with damp wood. He sat shivering in his soggy tent, eating cold canned beans, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. His phone still had battery and he stared at it, tempted to call someone, to admit he'd made a mistake. But he'd come too far to quit after 3 days. When the rain finally stopped, Daniel's problems were just beginning. He quickly realized that watching YouTube videos about survival skills and actually doing it were completely different things. His first attempt at building a permanent shelter was a disaster. He tried to construct a lean-to against a large tree, the way he'd seen in countless tutorials. It took him 3 days of hard work and he was pretty proud of it. Then a windstorm came through that night and blew the whole thing down in about 10 minutes. He tried again. This time he spent a week building what he thought was a solid structure. He used better materials, tied everything down properly, and even added a waterproof tarp for the roof. It looked good. It felt sturdy. Then the next rainstorm revealed that he'd built it in a natural drainage path. Water flowed right through the middle of his shelter like a river. He woke up at 2 a.m, lying in a puddle. The learning curve was brutal. Every single thing he tried seemed to go wrong. He attempted to start fires using the friction method he'd watched online. After 2 hours of rubbing sticks together until his hands were raw and blistered, he got nothing but frustration. He broke down and bought matches. His first attempts at fishing resulted in losing 3 hooks and 0 fish. He tried setting snares for rabbits using instructions from a survival book. He caught exactly nothing but did manage to trip over his own snare and fall face first into the mud. Food was a constant challenge. He'd brought supplies from the city, but they were running low. His attempts at identifying edible plants using a field guide were terrifying. Everything looked similar. He'd stare at a plant, then at the book, then back at the plant, never quite certain if it was safe or poisonous. He played it safe and stuck to things he was absolutely sure about, which meant his diet became incredibly boring. Rice, beans, canned vegetables. He lost weight fast, not because he wasn't eating, but because he was burning so many calories just trying to survive. The physical work was exhausting in a way his gym membership had never prepared him for. His hands, which had been soft from years of typing on keyboards, developed calluses and blisters. His back ached constantly. Muscles he didn't know he had screamed at him every morning. The first time he tried to chop firewood with an axe, he nearly took his foot off. The axe bounced off the log at an angle he didn't expect. After that scare, he spent an entire day just practicing how to swing an axe safely. But slowly, things started to improve. Daniel began keeping a journal, documenting what worked and what didn't. He learned to read the weather by watching the sky and feeling the wind. He figured out where water naturally flowed during rainstorms and chose his building locations more carefully. He got better at starting fires, eventually mastering several different methods. The day he successfully started a fire using flint and steel, he felt like he'd won the lottery. About 6 weeks in, when he was seriously questioning whether he could make it, Daniel met some neighbors. Well, neighbors in forest terms, meaning they lived about 10 miles away. An older couple, probably in their 60s, who'd been homesteading for 20 years. They'd heard through the local grapevine that some city guy was trying to live off-grid on the old Henderson property. They showed up one afternoon with a loaf of homemade bread and a lot of curiosity. Tom and Linda were like professors of forest living. They walked around Daniel's property with him, pointing out things he'd never noticed. They showed him which trees were dead and perfect for firewood, which ones would be good for building, and which ones he should never cut. They identified edible plants he'd walked past 100 times. They looked at his failed shelter attempts and gently suggested better approaches, sharing techniques they'd learned over decades. More importantly, they told him about the community. There was a whole network of people living alternative lifestyles within 50 miles. Homesteaders, off-gridders, preppers, and back-to-the-landers. They had a loosely organized barter system, skill-sharing workshops, and helped each other out when someone needed it. Tom invited Daniel to a gathering happening the following weekend. That gathering changed everything. Daniel met a dozen people who'd made similar journeys. A former lawyer who now raised goats, a retired nurse who grew medicinal herbs, a young couple who'd left tech jobs in California to build an earthship. Everyone had stories about their difficult first year. Everyone had made ridiculous mistakes. One guy admitted he'd tried to build his cabin entirely out of green wood and watched it warp and twist as it dried. Another woman confessed she'd planted her garden in full shade and wondered why nothing grew. They shared advice freely. Someone gave Daniel seeds for his future garden. Someone else had extra chicken wire and tools they weren't using. A guy named Rick offered to teach him basic carpentry skills. A woman who made pottery said she'd trade him bowls and cups for help fixing her fence in the spring. Daniel realized he didn't have to figure everything out alone. This was a community, just a different kind than he'd left behind. He started spending his days differently. Instead of randomly trying things and hoping they'd work, he had a plan. Rick came over twice a week to teach him woodworking basics. They started with simple projects: a table, shelves, a proper tool rack. Daniel learned how to measure twice and cut once, how to join wood without nails, how to read the grain and work with it instead of against it. His projects stopped falling apart. Linda taught him about foraging and gardening. They walked the forest together while she pointed out dozens of edible and medicinal plants. She taught him which mushrooms were safe and which would kill him. She showed him how to test soil, how to start seeds, how to save seeds for next year. She gave him cuttings from her perennial vegetables and explained how to care for them. Under her guidance, Daniel started a small garden plot, even though it was late in the season. Tom taught him about water systems. They spent days hiking around Daniel's property, mapping where water flowed naturally. Tom explained concepts like swales and berms, how to harvest rainwater, how to create natural filtration systems. He helped Daniel identify the best location for a future well. They built a simple gravity-fed water system using barrels and hoses that, while basic, provided clean water without having to haul it from the stream every day. The practical knowledge was valuable, but the mental shift was more important. Daniel stopped thinking like a software architect, where every problem had a clean, logical solution. The forest didn't work that way. Sometimes solutions were messy. Sometimes you had to try 3 different approaches before finding what worked. Sometimes the best answer was to wait and observe, rather than immediately taking action. His relationship with discomfort changed too. The first few weeks, every difficulty had felt like a crisis. Wet clothes, cold nights, sore muscles, simple meals. These things had made him miserable. But as the weeks turned into months, he adapted. Being cold wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't an emergency. Being tired was just part of working hard. Eating the same simple food every day wasn't exciting, but it kept him going. He stopped expecting comfort and started appreciating small pleasures. A warm fire on a cold night, the taste of fresh water from the stream, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. 3 months in, Daniel barely recognized himself. He'd lost 25 pounds, mostly from his soft office worker middle. His body had completely changed shape. He had actual muscles now, earned from swinging axes and hauling materials and digging in the earth. His hands were rough and scarred. His face was tan and weathered. He looked at his reflection in the stream one morning and saw someone who looked alive in a way his old mirror reflection never had. His family called every week, and the conversations were awkward. They couldn't understand his life now, and he couldn't explain it in a way that made sense to them. His mother kept asking when he was coming home, as if this was temporary. His father asked about his finances, worried he was burning through his savings. His brother made jokes about him becoming a crazy mountain man. Daniel tried to tell them about the skills he was learning, the community he'd found, the satisfaction of solving real problems with his hands. But it just came out sounding defensive. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenges or even the loneliness. It was the constant doubt. Late at night, lying in his tent, Daniel would sometimes panic. What was he doing? He'd given up everything for this. No job, no career, no clear path forward. Everyone thought he was crazy. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe this was just an extended camping trip that would end when reality set in. Maybe he should quit while he still had some savings left and could explain away the gap in his resume. But then morning would come. The sun would rise over the mountains, light filtering through the trees in golden shafts. The stream would burble peacefully. Birds would start their morning songs. Daniel would climb out of his tent, start a fire using skills he'd actually mastered, make coffee, and look around at his land. His land, this was his. No landlord, no mortgage company, no boss telling him what to do. And slowly, day by day, the doubt got quieter. The skills got stronger. The mistakes became less frequent. The learning curve started to level out. By the time winter approached, Daniel had a solid tent set up with a wood stove, a system for staying warm and dry, enough food stored up, and most importantly, he had confidence. He knew he could do this. He wasn't going back to the city. This was just the beginning. By the time winter broke and spring arrived, Daniel had spent 6 months in the forest. He'd survived. That alone felt like a victory. But somewhere during those long winter nights, huddled by his wood stove, he'd started thinking bigger. He didn't just want to survive anymore. He wanted to build something real. Something that proved you could live well without sacrificing the planet or your sanity in the process. The idea came to him gradually, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. His background was in systems architecture. He'd spent 15 years designing complex digital infrastructures where every component had to work together seamlessly. Why couldn't he apply that same thinking to a homestead? Instead of servers and databases, he'd work with solar panels and gardens, water, systems and food production. Everything connected, everything serving multiple purposes, nothing wasted. He started sketching ideas in his journal. Not just a cabin, but an entire integrated system. Energy production from multiple renewable sources. Water collection and natural filtration. Food growing in greenhouses year-round. Waste turned into compost and fertilizer. Everything designed to work together like a well-coded program. The more he planned, the more excited he got. This wasn't just about escaping the city anymore. This was about showing there was a better way. The first major project was the cabin itself. Daniel had learned enough basic carpentry to know he wanted to build it properly, not just slap together some walls and hope for the best. He spent 2 months just planning. He walked his property dozens of times, finding the perfect spot. Flat enough to build on, but elevated to avoid flooding. Close to the stream for water access, but not so close that erosion would be a problem. Positioned to maximize southern sun exposure for passive solar heating. He drew up detailed plans, modifying them over and over. The design was simple but clever. 1,200 square feet, which felt huge compared to his tent but small enough to heat efficiently. Large windows on the south side to capture sunlight and warmth. Smaller windows on the north to minimize heat loss. A living roof that would provide insulation and blend the structure into the landscape. Hand-hewn timber beams because they were beautiful, and because he could source them from his own land. Rick, his carpentry mentor, looked over the plans and whistled. This was ambitious for someone who'd barely known which end of a hammer to hold 6 months ago, but he agreed to help. So did Tom and several others from the community. There was an understanding in their world. You help with big projects, and that help gets returned when you need it. The timber work was brutal and satisfying in equal measure. Daniel selected trees carefully, marking ones that needed to come down anyway to thin the forest and improve the health of the remaining trees. Each tree was an education in respect and hard work. Cutting them down safely took skill he had to learn on the job. Hauling them out of the forest required creativity and a lot of sweat. Taking them to the small sawmill 30 miles away meant multiple trips in his truck. But watching those trees transform into lumber was magical. The first time he saw boards cut from a tree he'd personally felled, Daniel felt a connection to the material that went beyond anything he'd bought from a store. This wood had a story. He knew exactly where it came from. He'd done the work himself. When he built with it, that meaning would be embedded in every beam and board. The actual construction took all summer. Daniel and his helpers worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week. They dug the foundation by hand, mixing and pouring concrete in small batches. They raised the timber frame beam by beam, using a combination of muscle power and clever rigging systems. The day they got the main structure up and stood back to look at it, Daniel actually got choked up. This was real. This was happening. He insisted on doing as much of the work himself as possible. Not because he didn't trust others, but because he needed to know how every piece went together. If something broke in 5 years, he wanted to be able to fix it himself. So he learned electrical work, plumbing, roofing, everything. His friends would show him how to do something once, supervise him doing it the second time, then let him continue on his own. While the cabin rose from the ground, Daniel worked on the energy systems. He'd saved carefully and had enough money to invest in quality equipment. Solar panels went on a custom-built rack positioned for optimal sun exposure. He installed a micro-hydro system in the stream, using the constant flow of water to generate power even at night or during cloudy days. A bank of deep-cycle batteries stored the energy, giving him power 24 hours a day. The system was elegant in its design. The solar and hydro worked together, compensating for each other's weaknesses. Cloudy days when solar was weak were often rainy days when the stream ran higher. Sunny days produced excess solar power that the hydro didn't need to supplement. He built monitoring systems using his old tech skills, creating dashboards that showed exactly how much power was being generated and consumed at any moment. Water was the next challenge. Tom had taught him well, and Daniel designed a multi-stage system that would make any engineer proud. Rain gutters fed into large storage tanks. The water passed through natural filtration using sand, gravel, and charcoal before reaching the cabin. A simple gravity-fed system meant no pumps were needed for basic water pressure. For backup, he could always haul water from the stream if necessary. But the rainwater system proved incredibly reliable. The garden and greenhouse projects happened simultaneously. Linda had convinced him that food security was just as important as shelter and water. Daniel built raised beds using lumber scraps and rocks from his property. He learned about soil composition, adding compost and amendments to transform the forest floor into productive growing space. The greenhouse was his pride and joy, built mostly from salvaged windows and materials people were throwing away. He'd driven to the city a few times to pick up materials, and each trip reinforced that he'd made the right choice. The noise, the traffic, the stressed-out faces, the constant rush. It all felt alien now. He'd load his truck with salvaged windows, old lumber, and discarded materials people in the city considered worthless, and couldn't wait to get back to his forest. The greenhouse design was innovative. He built it into a hillside for natural temperature regulation, The earth provided insulation, keeping it warmer in winter and cooler in summer. He installed water barrels painted black on the north wall. They absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, stabilizing the temperature. Automatic vent openers controlled airflow without electricity. The whole thing cost less than $500 and worked better than commercial greenhouses. As fall approached and the major construction wrapped up, Daniel started connecting all the systems. This was where his background really shined. He understood how to make complex systems work together efficiently. The excess heat from his wood stove was captured and distributed throughout the cabin. Gray water from sinks was filtered and used to water plants. Kitchen scraps went to chickens who produced eggs and fertilizer for the garden. The garden produced food, and waste went into compost that improved the soil. Everything cycled, everything connected. Word was spreading beyond his immediate community. People heard about the tech guy building a high-tech off-grid homestead and got curious. Visitors started showing up, usually on weekends. Some were skeptics wanting to see if it was really possible to live this way. Others were dreamers thinking about making similar changes. Daniel welcomed them all, giving tours and explaining his systems. One visitor was a blogger who wrote about sustainable living. She spent a day at the property, asking endless questions and taking hundreds of photos. Her article went viral in certain circles. Suddenly, Daniel was getting emails from all over the country. People wanted advice. Some wanted to visit. A few wanted to hire him as a consultant for their own projects. His family visited too, finally. His mother had been begging to see what he'd built, equal parts worried about her son and curious about what he was actually doing. When they arrived and saw the cabin, the gardens, the whole integrated setup, they were speechless. This wasn't a crazy person living like a caveman. This was a thoughtfully designed home that happened to be completely self-sufficient. His father walked around the property, examining everything with a critical eye. He checked the timber frame joints, tested the solar panel mounts, looked at the garden beds. Finally, he turned to Daniel and said something that meant more than any compliment from his old boss ever had. He said he was proud. Not proud that his son had a fancy job title or made a lot of money, but proud that he'd built something real with his own two hands. His mother cried, but for different reasons than before. She'd been so worried that he was suffering, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he was lonely and miserable in the woods. Instead, she saw someone healthy, strong, and genuinely happy. The stressed, exhausted person who'd left the city a year ago was gone. In his place was someone who slept well, ate fresh food, and spent his days doing meaningful work. The cabin still needed finishing touches. Daniel spent the next few months working on details. He built furniture from wood he'd milled himself. He installed shelving, created storage solutions, added personal touches that made the space feel like home. Every nail he hammered, every board he placed, he did with intention and care. This wasn't just construction. This was craft. By the time the first snow fell, 1 year after leaving the city, Daniel sat in his completed cabin and took stock. He had a warm, beautiful home that cost him nothing to operate. He had abundant clean water. He had reliable electricity. He had a greenhouse producing fresh vegetables even as snow fell outside. He had a supportive community of friends who'd become like family. He had skills he never imagined learning. And most importantly, he had peace. The cost had been less than he'd spent on 2 years of city rent. The value was beyond measure. He'd proven to himself that it was possible. You didn't have to choose between modern comfort and environmental responsibility. You didn't have to sacrifice quality of life to live sustainably. With thought, planning, and hard work, you could have both. Late that night, sitting by his wood stove with a cup of tea, Daniel opened his laptop. He still had satellite internet, one of his few remaining connections to the digital world. His inbox was full of messages from people who'd read about his project. Questions, requests for advice, people wanting to know if they could do something similar. He started typing responses, sharing what he'd learned, encouraging others to consider a different path. He'd left the city to save himself. He'd survived the brutal learning curve. He'd built something remarkable. But as he responded to those messages, Daniel realized his journey was entering a new phase. Maybe his purpose wasn't just to escape the system, but to show others that alternatives existed. That you didn't have to stay stuck in a life that was slowly killing you. That change was possible, even when everyone thought you were crazy for trying. 2 years after disappearing into the forest, Daniel decided it was time. Time to invite everyone who doubted him to see what he'd built. His former colleagues, skeptical friends, worried family members. Everyone who'd laughed, everyone who'd thought he was having a breakdown, everyone who'd given him 6 months before he came crawling back to the city. He sent out invitations for a summer gathering, keeping the details vague. "Come see the compound," he wrote. "Come see what's possible." The responses were mixed. His mother was excited, having already visited several times. His father was bringing his camera, genuinely interested in the technical aspects of the systems, but several of his former co-workers responded with thinly veiled skepticism. One guy replied with a gif of a guy living in a shack. Another made a joke about checking for running water before visiting. His old boss didn't respond at all, then sent a brief message the day before saying he'd try to stop by if his schedule allowed. Daniel spent weeks preparing for the visit, not because the place wasn't ready, but because he wanted to showcase everything properly. He created a walking tour route through the property. He prepared information sheets about each system. He made sure everything was functioning at peak performance. This wasn't about showing off. It was about proving that another way of living was not just possible, but practical and rewarding. The day arrived warm and sunny. Perfect weather. Daniel had invited about 30 people, and surprisingly, most said they were coming. They started arriving around noon, parking along the dirt road because there wasn't space for everyone on his property. He watched them walk up the path, these people from his old life, and he could see the expectations on their faces. They were prepared to be polite about whatever rustic situation they found. They were prepared to feel sorry for him. They were not prepared for what they actually saw. The first thing that struck visitors was how beautiful everything was. This wasn't a survivalist camp or a rough homestead. The timber frame cabin looked like something from an architecture magazine, with its natural wood beams and living roof covered in native plants and wildflowers. The large windows reflected the forest, making the building seem like part of the landscape rather than an intrusion. Solar panels were arranged artistically on their rack. Garden beds were laid out in pleasing geometric patterns. Everything had an intentional, designed quality. His mother arrived first, playing host and proudly showing people around like she'd built the place herself. Daniel smiled, watching her explain the solar system to his former co-workers, most of whom looked completely confused. They walked toward the cabin, and he watched their faces change as they got closer. This wasn't what they'd expected at all. He opened the door and invited everyone inside. The interior stopped people in their tracks. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with natural light. Hand-hewn beams crossed the ceiling, each one showing the marks of careful craftsmanship. The kitchen featured a large stone counter, a deep farmhouse sink, and open shelving displaying handmade pottery. A wood stove sat in the center, providing both heat and cooking capability. Comfortable furniture filled the living space. Books lined one wall. It was warm, inviting, and surprisingly modern despite being completely off-grid. One of his former co-workers literally stood with her mouth open. She finally managed to say something like, "Wait, you have running water?" Daniel turned on the tap. Clean water flowed freely. He explained the rainwater collection system, the natural filtration, the gravity-fed pressure. Her husband, a plumber by trade before getting into tech, examined the setup and kept shaking his head in impressed disbelief. This system was better designed than most city systems he'd worked on. Daniel showed them the electrical panel, explaining how the solar and micro-hydro systems worked together. He pulled up his monitoring dashboard on a laptop, showing real-time power generation and consumption. They had electricity 24 hours a day, more than enough for lights, computers, a refrigerator, power tools, everything they needed. No generator noise, no fuel costs, just clean, renewable energy. But his old boss, who'd finally shown up halfway through, was still skeptical. He pointed at the laptop and asked where the internet came from. Daniel pulled up a browser and loaded a web page instantly. Satellite internet, not as fast as fiber optic, but more than adequate for video calls, streaming, research, whatever he needed. His boss looked genuinely confused, like this somehow violated the rules of off-grid living. You were supposed to be disconnected, not watching Netflix in a cabin you built yourself. The kitchen tour really got people. Daniel opened his fridge, which was full of fresh vegetables, eggs from his chickens, preserved foods he'd made himself. He showed them the pantry with hundreds of jars of canned goods. The freezer full of food he'd grown and preserved. People who'd assumed he was living on beans and rice were confronted with abundance. His mother, beaming with pride, mentioned that everything on the table for lunch had come from the property or been traded with neighbors. Lunch was served outside on a large table Daniel had built from his own timber. Fresh salad with greens from the greenhouse, bread baked that morning in his outdoor oven, eggs from his chickens, cheese traded from a neighbor who kept goats. Everything tasted incredible in a way that store-bought food never quite matched. People ate and kept exchanging glances, having whole silent conversations about how wrong they'd been. After lunch came the full property tour. Daniel led them through the gardens, explaining the raised bed system, the companion planting strategies, the natural pest control methods. The greenhouse stopped traffic again. Even in summer, it was producing amazing amounts of food: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, herbs, greens. He explained how it worked year-round, how he'd designed it to maintain stable temperatures without any external heating. People took photos, asked questions. Several mentioned they wanted to build something similar at home. The chicken coop was next, a beautifully designed structure that kept the birds safe while giving them plenty of space. One of his former colleagues, who'd been pretty quiet until now, mentioned that he'd always wanted chickens but thought it was too complicated. Daniel explained it wasn't that hard once you learned the basics and offered to help him get started if he was serious. The guy looked thoughtful, like maybe he was actually considering it. They walked past the workshop, which was filled with tools and half-finished projects. The woodshed stacked with neatly arranged firewood, the composting system that turned waste into rich soil, the trails he'd cut through the property for hiking and observation. Every system connected to another. Everything served multiple purposes. Nothing was wasted. It was elegant in its simplicity and sophisticated in its execution, but the real showstopper was the water system. Daniel had built an observation deck next to the stream where his micro-hydro generator sat. The sound of flowing water was peaceful. The system itself was a work of art, functional but beautiful. He explained how it generated power constantly, how little maintenance it required, how it didn't harm the stream ecosystem at all. Tom, his mentor, had helped with the design and they'd been careful to do it right. People kept asking about the cost. How much had all this required? Daniel broke it down for them. The land had cost less than a decent used car. Materials for the cabin, sourced carefully and often salvaged, had been surprisingly affordable. The solar system was the single biggest expense, but prices had dropped significantly in recent years. The total investment was less than he'd spent on 3 years of city rent, less than the down payment on a modest house in the suburbs. But instead of a mortgage, he owned everything outright and had 0 monthly costs. His old boss pulled him aside at one point. The guy looked uncomfortable, like he was struggling with something. Finally, he admitted that he'd thought Daniel had lost his mind, that leaving a good job to live in the woods was the dumbest decision he'd ever seen someone make. But standing here seeing this, he got it. He didn't know if he could ever do something like this himself. But he understood why someone would want to. He looked tired, Daniel noticed. Older than his years, still fighting the same battles in the same office Daniel had escaped. Several of his former co-workers cornered him with serious questions. Not joking questions, real questions. How did you learn all this? Where did you start? How much savings do you need before making a jump like this? Could you do it with a family? What about health care? What about retirement? They weren't mocking anymore. They were considering. The seed of possibility had been planted. One woman pulled him aside and quietly admitted she was miserable. Same job pressures, same stress, same feeling that life was happening to her rather than being lived. She asked if he ever regretted leaving. Daniel thought about it honestly before answering. There were hard moments, sure, times when he missed the convenience of the city. But regret? Never. Not once. The hard moments here were real challenges he could solve with his hands and mind. The hard moments in the city were just grinding pressure that never ended and never meant anything. As the afternoon wore into evening, people started to leave. Everyone thanked him, many seeming genuinely moved by what they'd seen. His mother hugged him tight, whispering that she was sorry for doubting him. His father shook his hand, man to man, with real respect in his eyes. Even his skeptical friends admitted they were impressed. One guy joked that if the apocalypse came, he was heading straight here. Daniel laughed, but privately thought that you didn't need an apocalypse to justify living well. A few people stayed later, sitting around the fire pit Daniel had built. They talked about dreams and regrets, about paths not taken, about the courage it takes to change your life. One of his old colleagues admitted he'd been looking at the same promotion for 5 years, always thinking next year would be different. Next year would be when he finally got ahead. But next year never came, and he was starting to realize it never would. The system wasn't designed for people to get ahead. It was designed to keep you running in place. Another friend talked about his kid, who he barely saw because of work hours, about his marriage, which was struggling under the weight of 2 careers in no time, about the house he'd bought that required both incomes to maintain, which meant they were trapped. He looked around at Daniel's setup and said, "You just walked away from all of it." Daniel nodded. That's exactly what he'd done. And the crazy thing was, it wasn't actually that hard once you decided to do it. The hard part was deciding. The rest was just work. As the fire died down and his last guests left, Daniel sat alone looking at the stars. The same stars he'd seen his first night here, but everything was different now. He'd proven something important, not just to his doubters, but to himself. This wasn't a fantasy or a phase or a breakdown. This was a legitimate, sustainable, meaningful way to live. You could have modern comforts and technology without sacrificing your soul to a corporate job. You could be self-sufficient without being isolated. You could live well without buying into a system that made you miserable. His phone buzzed with messages. People thanking him for the day, asking follow-up questions, a few admitting they couldn't stop thinking about what they'd seen. One message made him smile. It was from the colleague who'd sent him that gif of a shack 2 years ago. It just said, "I was wrong. What you've built is incredible. Any chance you'd consult on a project for me?" "I'm serious." Daniel looked around at his compound, his home, his life, everything he'd built with his own hands and help from his community. The people who'd laughed weren't laughing anymore. They were asking how they could do the same thing. And suddenly, Daniel understood his purpose had shifted again. He'd escaped, he'd survived, he'd built something remarkable. Now, maybe it was time to help others do the same, to show that the path he'd taken wasn't just for crazy people or dropouts. It was for anyone brave enough to question whether the default life path was actually the right one for them. The compound wasn't just a home anymore. It was proof that alternatives existed, proof that change was possible, proof that a better life was waiting for anyone willing to reach for it. And that, Daniel thought, might be the most important thing he'd built. The photos from the gathering spread like wildfire across social media. Daniel hadn't posted them himself, but his visitors had. Shot after shot of the cabin, the gardens, the solar panels, the whole integrated system. Within days, the images were being shared thousands of times. Comments ranged from inspired to skeptical to downright hostile. Some people called it goals. Others said it was privileged escapism. A few accused him of faking it. But the engagement was massive, and Daniel's inbox exploded with messages. At first, he tried to respond to everyone personally. Long, detailed emails explaining his journey, offering advice, answering questions. But within a week, he was getting 50 messages a day. People wanted to visit. News outlets wanted interviews. A documentary filmmaker reached out about following his story. A publisher asked if he'd considered writing a book. YouTube channels wanted to feature him. It was overwhelming in a completely different way than his old job, but overwhelming nonetheless. Tom and Linda came over one evening and found him staring at his laptop with exhausted frustration. They laughed in that gentle way older folks do when young people are figuring out something they'd learned decades ago. The whole point of this life, Linda reminded him, was to not be overwhelmed. If this was stressing him out, he was doing it wrong. Tom suggested he set boundaries, respond to what felt right, and ignore the rest. The internet would move on to the next viral thing eventually. But something interesting started happening. Other people from his old workplace began reaching out privately. Not just casual questions, but serious conversations. A woman named Ashley had been planning her exit for a year. She'd bought land in Oregon and wanted to do something similar. Could she visit? Learn from his experience? Daniel said yes. Then another former co-worker reached out with the same request. Then another. Within 2 months, he'd hosted a dozen visitors, all people from his old life, who were considering radical changes. Teaching came naturally to Daniel, which surprised him. He'd always thought of himself as a behind-the-scenes person, not a mentor or instructor. But sharing what he'd learned felt good, important even. He started offering weekend workshops at his property. Basic skills for people considering off-grid living. How to evaluate land, how to plan systems, how to start small and build up, how to avoid the mistakes he'd made. The workshops were popular. People drove from several states to attend. They'd camp on his property, spend 3 days learning hands-on skills, and leave with knowledge and confidence they didn't have before. Daniel charged just enough to cover his expenses and make it worth his time. The money wasn't the point. The point was spreading the idea that this lifestyle was achievable, not just some fantasy for the wealthy or desperate. One of his former co-workers, a guy named Kevin who'd been at the company for 12 years, showed up at a workshop. Daniel barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, looked healthier, seemed lighter somehow. Over a campfire that night, Kevin shared his story. He'd quit 3 months after visiting the compound, sold his house, sold most of his stuff, bought a small property in Montana. He was building his own place now, working part-time remotely to cover expenses while he established his homestead. Seeing Daniel's place had given him permission to change his life. More stories like that kept coming. A couple who'd been drowning in debt had radically downsized and started a small farm. A single mother who'd been working 2 jobs bought cheap land and was building a tiny house. A retired engineer was designing water systems for other homesteaders, doing meaningful work instead of just playing golf. Daniel started hearing about a network effect. People he'd influenced were influencing others. The ripples were spreading far beyond what he'd started. A journalist from a major magazine came to do a profile. She stayed for 3 days, asking deep questions about sustainability, privilege, practicality, and philosophy. The resulting article was fair and thought-provoking. It didn't pretend off-grid living was for everyone, but it presented it as a legitimate option for people feeling crushed by modern life. The article went viral too, bringing another wave of interest. But not all attention was positive. Some critics accused him of promoting escapism instead of systemic change. Others said his approach was only possible for people with savings, ignoring the privilege involved. A few suggested he was profiting off people's misery by selling workshops. Daniel took the criticism seriously, even when it stung. He started being more upfront about the advantages he'd had. The savings from his old job, the education that taught him how to learn new things, the lack of dependence that gave him freedom to take risks. He began offering sliding-scale pricing for workshops, letting people pay what they could afford. He created free online content sharing his knowledge with anyone who wanted it. He partnered with organizations helping low-income folks access land and resources. If this movement was going to be meaningful, it couldn't just be for middle-class professionals with nest eggs. It had to be accessible to people who needed it most.